It began, as these stories so often do, with a question that seemed almost unthinkable. What would drive a man who once gave up his royal titles, his homeland, and the very family that shaped him, to turn around and throw out the woman he risked it all for? To understand the weight of that question, one must picture the quiet streets of Montecito, California, where sprawling estates with manicured lawns give off the illusion of peace and permanence. Behind the gates of one such estate, Harry and Meghan built their world. Or at least, that was the image they wanted the world to see. The sprawling mansion, the chickens in the backyard, the carefully crafted interviews, all designed to show the public that this was a couple who had survived the brutality of the British monarchy and emerged stronger for it. But inside those walls, beneath the glossy sheen of success, something far darker simmered. The name Diana Spencer carries a weight that transcends borders and generations. For Harry, his mother wasn't just the beloved people's princess, mourned by millions. She was the anchor of his childhood, the woman who held his hand through a turbulent upbringing, and the ghost who shaped the man he would become. Her jewelry collection was more than sparkling diamonds and glittering sapphires. Each piece was a fragment of her story, a memory etched into gold and silver, a connection Harry carried with him long after her tragic death. Those jewels weren't simply heirlooms. They were sacred relics of a life cut short. To tamper with them was to tamper with his grief, his identity, and his loyalty. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. This is why whispers of betrayal cut so deep. Imagine the shock when rumors began to circulate. Rumors that suggested Meghan had done the unthinkable, selling off Diana's precious jewelry collection to private buyers, allegedly in secret. At first, such a claim felt absurd. Meghan, who had positioned herself as a champion of Diana's legacy, often drawing comparisons between their struggles, would surely never desecrate something so sacred. Yet the whispers grew louder, punctuated by claims of missing pieces and clandestine meetings with jewelers. For Harry, who had already sacrificed the safety of royal protocol to protect Meghan, the idea that she might exploit his most painful connection for profit was not just betrayal, it was devastation. The story does not begin with the jewelry itself, though. It begins with trust, and how fragile trust can be when tested by ambition. From the moment Harry introduced Meghan to the world, the comparisons to Diana were relentless. Meghan was cast as a modern Diana, a woman hounded by the press, misunderstood by the establishment, and destined to rewrite history. Harry leaned into that narrative, perhaps too eagerly, believing that in Meghan he had found a kindred spirit who understood his scars. When he left the monarchy in 2020, it was under the banner of protecting her, protecting their children, and choosing love over duty. Montecito was supposed to be their sanctuary. Instead, it became the stage for an unraveling. In the early days, the jewelry was often displayed with pride. Meghan wore Diana's aquamarine ring during their wedding reception, a piece Harry had given her as a symbol of trust. She was photographed on several occasions with Diana's butterfly earrings, the gold bracelets, and even smaller, less recognizable pieces that held personal meaning. Every appearance carried a dual purpose: to honor Diana's memory and to strengthen the couple's claim as the rightful bearers of her legacy. For the public, these moments were heartwarming. For Harry, they were intimate reminders of the mother he lost. But behind the photographs, not every piece remained accounted for. The beginning of suspicion was almost imperceptible. A staff member, perhaps too familiar with the family's possessions, noticed something missing. A necklace that had been carefully catalogued seemed absent. When asked, Meghan allegedly brushed it off with a casual remark that it had been stored elsewhere, or that Harry himself had misplaced it. Harry, caught between his devotion to his wife and the unease in his gut, chose to believe her. Love demands belief, even when the evidence hints otherwise. But seeds of doubt, once planted, are difficult to ignore. By the time the whispers reached Harry, the stakes had grown impossibly high. These weren't just accessories. They were emotional lifelines, reminders of Diana's laughter, her tenderness, her rebellion against the royal mold. When a man feels his mother's memory slipping away, it is not just about jewels. It is about betrayal of the deepest kind. The middle of this story is where the heartache intensifies. where Harry finds himself torn between the woman he vowed to protect and the mother he never stopped grieving. What makes this scandal so gripping is not only the alleged act, but also the timing. Harry and Meghan's life in California was already under intense scrutiny. The Netflix deals, the podcast controversies, the public spats with the royal family, all of it placed them under a microscope. Trust between them was already fragile, strained by financial pressures and relentless headlines. If Meghan did indeed broker secret deals to sell Diana's collection, one must ask, was it desperation, greed, or something more complicated? Was it her way of carving independence from Harry's past, or was it simply another calculated step in building her brand? These are the questions that haunted Harry as suspicion gave way to confrontation. And confrontation did come, explosive and raw. It is said that Harry cornered Meghan in their Montecito home after receiving confirmation that certain items had been appraised by private jewelers. The words exchanged in that argument will never be fully known, but one can imagine the weight of them. Harry, torn open by the idea that his wife might have commodified his mother's legacy, would have spoken from a place of fury and heartbreak. Meghan, accused and cornered, would have defended herself, perhaps insisting she was misunderstood, that the pieces weren't as important as he believed, or that she had every right to use what was given to her. The truth of that night remains buried, but the aftermath tells its own story. Harry made a decision, and that decision was to end it, at least, to end the sanctuary they had built together. He ordered Meghan out of Montecito, the very home that symbolized their freedom from the monarchy. To throw someone out of a home is no small gesture. It is the ultimate declaration that trust has been shattered beyond repair. Neighbors whispered about the sight of Meghan leaving. Staffers quietly shared their observations, and the tabloids devoured every morsel of the fallout. The end of the introduction leaves us here, standing at the edge of betrayal and heartbreak. A prince who once defied his family to stand by his wife now stands alone in the house he thought would shelter them both. A woman once hailed as his salvation, now cast out under the shadow of suspicion and scandal. The jewelry, the jewels of Diana, sit at the center of it all, silent witnesses to a storm that has torn through love, legacy, and loyalty. But the question that lingers, and the one that drives the story forward, is this: was Meghan truly guilty of selling Diana's jewels, or was this yet another case of perception twisting truth into something darker? What drove Harry to make the choice he made, and what does it say about the fragility of trust in even the most powerful of relationships? The answers lie in the chapters that follow, where every whisper, every confrontation, and every revelation will bring us closer to the truth. The story of Diana's jewelry collection is not just about diamonds, sapphires, or gold. It is about memory, about loss, about the fragments of a life so luminous that even decades after her passing, her aura lingers in every polished stone and delicate clasp. For Prince Harry, every piece in that collection was more than a work of craftsmanship. They were echoes of his mother's laughter, her resilience, her rebellion against tradition, and her quiet vulnerability. To begin this chapter, we must journey back to the 1980s and 1990s, when Diana herself first wore these pieces, each one becoming part of the iconography that defined her as more than a royal, but as a global phenomenon. When Diana married Prince Charles in 1981, her jewelry became a focal point of public fascination. The world remembers her engagement ring vividly, a sapphire encircled by diamonds, bold and unconventional for its time. That ring later went to William, who gave it to Catherine. But the rest of her collection was divided between her sons. Rings, earrings, bracelets, tiaras. They were not simply wealth. They were tokens of a woman who had captivated the world and yet lived in private turmoil. Imagine Harry, as a boy of just 12, walking behind his mother's coffin, knowing those jewels now represented the only tangible connection to her touch. For him, every piece became an anchor, tying him to the warmth he lost so suddenly. Harry grew up with those jewels as silent companions. Each time he saw them worn by others in photographs or locked away in safes, he felt their presence. They carried not only monetary value, but a narrative. Who Diana was, how she lived, and the tenderness she gave her sons even in a cold royal environment. When the time came for him to share those treasures with Meghan, It was an act of profound trust. He was opening a vault, not of stones, but of his heart. To hand over Diana's butterfly earrings or the aquamarine ring was to say, in unspoken words, "You are now part of this memory. You are now part of her story." The first time Meghan wore Diana's jewelry publicly was hailed as a moment of continuity. She stepped out with the butterfly earrings in Sydney during the royal tour, smiling at cameras, holding Harry's hand, and glowing as she introduced herself to the world as the Duchess of Sussex. The media framed it as symbolic, a woman stepping into the late princess's role, carrying her torch into a new generation. The aquamarine ring at the wedding reception became another moment of symbolism. Meghan wasn't just marrying Harry, she was inheriting Diana's legacy. To Harry, it was reassurance that his mother's presence was still with him, watching over this new chapter of his life. But jewelry, unlike memories, can be misplaced. It can be traded, sold, or stolen. It can be weighed not just by sentiment, but by its market value. And that is where the tension in this story begins to tighten. Harry's view of the jewelry was deeply emotional, almost sacred. For Meghan, it was a different kind of treasure. To her, wearing Diana's pieces elevated her public image. It tethered her to history, to prestige, to a story larger than herself. Every photograph of Meghan adorned in those jewels sent signals of power, status, and connection. While Harry saw his mother, Meghan saw a brand. That divergence in perspective, subtle at first, grew into a chasm that would one day erupt. Consider how these jewels were stored in Montecito. A secure vault, accessible only to Harry and Meghan, sat beneath the mansion. Each item catalogued, each piece noted. Staff whispered about how Meghan frequently visited the collection, sometimes alone, sometimes with advisors or stylists. She would try them on in front of mirrors, rehearsing appearances. For her, they were tools of presentation, amplifiers of an image she carefully crafted. But for Harry, each visit was a pilgrimage. He would hold a bracelet and recall his mother's wrist as she held his hand. He would look at the aquamarine ring and remember her smile at summer events. To him, the jewels whispered of love. To Meghan, they shouted of opportunity. There is an undeniable reality in the modern world. Diana's jewelry is priceless not only sentimentally, but financially. Collectors across the globe, from Middle Eastern royalty to American billionaires, would pay fortunes to own even the smallest of pieces. The idea of one ring or one necklace leaving Harry's possession for money is a thought he could not bear. It would be like selling his mother's memory. Yet in the luxury markets of Los Angeles, New York, and Dubai, whispers began circulating about certain items being appraised. Nothing was proven, nothing was public, but whispers are powerful, and whispers are what start storms. As we build through this chapter, we must pause to reflect. Why do objects carry such power over us? Why does a piece of jewelry, inanimate and cold, become so loaded with meaning that it can tear apart relationships? The answer lies in human memory. Objects, unlike people, do not change. They outlast us. They sit silently, waiting for us to imbue them with meaning. For Harry, Diana's jewelry became symbols of permanence in a world where his mother had been stolen from him far too soon. To see them diminish to transactions was, in his mind, to lose her all over again. The tragedy of this story lies in the intersection of memory and ambition. On one side stood Harry, clutching the jewelry as his last connection to Diana's embrace. On the other stood Meghan, who may have seen the collection as leverage, a way to secure influence, wealth, or independence. Neither perspective was entirely irrational, but together they were combustible. The collection became not a bridge between them, but a wedge. Each piece that disappeared, each rumor that spread, was another crack in the foundation of their marriage. By the time this chapter closes, the jewels are no longer silent. They have become characters in the story themselves. Witnesses to a clash between love and legacy, between grief and survival. They sparkle under lights at charity events, they glint in photographs, and they vanish quietly when the vault is opened again. Their absence is felt as keenly as betrayal, their presence as heavy as ghosts. And at the heart of it all stands Harry, a man torn between the love of his life and the memory of the mother who defined him. To understand the unraveling of trust between Harry and Meghan, it is important to step inside their Montecito sanctuary and see how life unfolded behind those pristine gates. When they first purchased the mansion, it was touted as their palace of independence, a sprawling estate with rose gardens, ancient olive trees, and sweeping views of the ocean. For the couple, it symbolized freedom, a break from the scrutiny of Buckingham Palace, a chance to create their own world on their own terms. But sanctuaries can also become prisons, especially when secrets begin to seep into their walls. Life in Montecito was, at least on the surface, idyllic. Meghan carefully curated images of herself feeding chickens with Archie, baking with Harry in a rustic kitchen, and strolling hand in hand through the grounds. These glimpses, offered through interviews and magazine spreads, painted a picture of simplicity and authenticity. Yet those who looked closer knew the truth was far more complex. Montecito was not just a home. It was a fortress, both literal and symbolic. With security teams on constant watch, reinforced gates, and a carefully controlled social circle, it felt more like a compound designed to keep the world out and the image within intact. Meghan was at the center of this carefully orchestrated lifestyle. Every detail, from the flowers in the garden to the angle of the sunlit photographs released to the press, was part of an ongoing narrative. Meghan as the modern, liberated duchess, thriving beyond the confines of the royal institution. She wanted the world to see her not as a victim, but as a woman who had transformed adversity into triumph. But what happens when the image of triumph requires resources, assets, and symbols that are not hers alone to control? That is the question Montecito began to answer. Harry, on the other hand, was caught in two worlds. On one hand, he cherished the California life Meghan had introduced him to, the yoga, the ocean air, the Hollywood-style community of neighbors like Oprah Winfrey and Ellen DeGeneres. On the other, he longed for the grounding of his roots, the traditions and symbols that connected him to Diana. While Meghan looked forward, Harry often looked back. The jewelry became the perfect example of that divide. Meghan saw it as a tool for their present image. Harry saw it as a relic of his past. The mansion itself reflected this tension. Its walls, adorned with photographs of Diana alongside shots from Meghan's career, seemed like an uneasy blend of two legacies. Staff members described a household that was meticulously run, yet often tense. Meghan demanded perfection, from her wardrobe, from the staff, from the way her family was presented to the outside world. Harry, while publicly supportive, privately struggled with the pressure of living inside an image he had not fully chosen. When whispers about the jewelry began, it was not in a vacuum. It was in this environment of control, ambition, and a relentless need to maintain a public narrative. Neighbors in Montecito described Meghan as both visible and elusive. She was often seen jogging on the private lanes, visiting organic markets, and attending select gatherings, but she always seemed to carry with her a sense of performance. Everything felt deliberate. Her friendships in Montecito mirrored her ambitions. Celebrities, power brokers, people who could elevate her status and reinforce her position. In those circles, Diana's jewelry was more than memory, it was currency. A conversation piece that connected Meghan not just to Harry, but to a myth larger than either of them. Each time she wore a piece of Diana's collection to an event, the message was clear. Meghan was not just Harry's wife, she was his mother's heir in spirit. For Harry, this display was bittersweet. He wanted the world to see Meghan as part of his life and, by extension, part of Diana's legacy. Yet every time he saw the jewels glint under camera flashes, he could not help but wonder if they were being used. It was as though the very things he treasured as sacred were slowly becoming tools of publicity. He didn't voice this often, but the unease grew inside him. When he noticed that some pieces were no longer where he remembered placing them, the unease turned into suspicion. But suspicion alone cannot tear down a marriage. It needs an environment of strain to ignite, and Montecito was that environment. Financially, the couple's lifestyle was expensive to maintain. Their security costs were staggering, their contracts with media companies demanding. Meghan, always ambitious, pushed for more visibility, more projects, more opportunities to expand their empire. The jewelry, in this context, could easily shift from sacred heirlooms to resources that could be leveraged. Even the possibility of this happening was enough to unsettle Harry. To him, Montecito was supposed to be the place where they built a life together free from the pressures of money and monarchy. Instead, it began to feel like a gilded cage, where every decision carried the weight of image, money, and survival. And so, Montecito became a paradox. For Meghan, it was proof of success. The house, the lifestyle, the friendships, the image of a duchess thriving in America. For Harry, it became a daily reminder of the cost of his choices, estrangement from his family, loneliness in a land that never fully felt like home, and now the slow unraveling of trust with the woman he had sacrificed everything for. The jewelry, sitting in a vault beneath their mansion, was no longer just a collection of stones. It was a silent witness to their diverging paths. By the end of this chapter, Montecito stands not as a sanctuary, but as a stage. Every garden path, every gated entrance, every gilded room becomes part of a larger play where image collides with intimacy, ambition collides with memory, and trust is tested with every choice. It was in this very environment, behind those sunlit gates, that the seeds of the scandal took root. Meghan's Montecito life was not simply a life of glamour and freedom. It was the backdrop against which the most devastating betrayal of Harry's trust would unfold. It is often said that betrayals do not reveal themselves in grand gestures, but in whispers, in the small inconsistencies that begin to gnaw at certainty. For Harry, the first whispers of suspicion came not from a headline or an explosive confrontation, but from the subtle realization that something was out of place. The jewelry, his mother's jewelry, was supposed to be untouchable. Every piece was catalogued, every gem a part of his private archive of memory. Yet as weeks turned into months in Montecito, the certainty he had in their safekeeping began to unravel. It began quietly. A staff member who had been in service since the couple's early days in California noticed that one of Diana's bracelets was missing from the secure vault. At first, Harry dismissed it as an oversight, convinced it must have been loaned out for an event or temporarily misplaced during a photo shoot. Meghan, when asked, gave a quick explanation that she had sent it for cleaning, that perhaps it had been placed in another case. Her answer seemed plausible enough, but when the same uncertainty repeated itself, when yet another piece could not immediately be accounted for, doubt settled in. Suspicion is a peculiar kind of poison. It does not shout, it whispers. It creeps in at night when the house is quiet, when memories are loud, when the heart replays conversations with sharper edges than before. Harry began to notice things that once seemed innocuous. Meghan taking longer in the vault than expected. Packages arriving at odd hours. Private phone calls conducted in hushed tones in corners of the mansion. None of these, on their own, were damning. But together they began to form a picture, one Harry did not want to see. He confided in a close friend, someone he trusted beyond the Hollywood circle. The friend's response was cautious. "Harry, sometimes we see what we fear most. Are you sure you're not imagining this because you're afraid to lose more of your mother?" It was a fair question. Harry's grief for Diana had always shaped the way he viewed the world. Perhaps he was overreacting, projecting old wounds onto new shadows. But suspicion, once ignited, rarely extinguishes itself with reason. The whispers grew louder when Harry was contacted discreetly by an acquaintance in London. The acquaintance, a dealer in high-value jewelry, claimed he had been approached about acquiring items that matched the description of Diana's pieces. He would not say directly who had made the inquiry, but he warned Harry that the description was too precise to be coincidence. Harry's blood ran cold. The thought that someone, anyone, could be offering up his mother's treasures for appraisal was unbearable. He wanted to believe it was a mistake, a rumor, or worse, a targeted attempt to smear Meghan. Yet in his gut, something twisted. He returned to the vault one night, alone, flashlight in hand, determined to check each piece against his memory. The aquamarine ring was still there. The butterfly earrings, still there. But when he came to a delicate gold bracelet Diana had once worn during a charity visit, he froze. It was gone. He tore through the case, checked every drawer, every corner. Nothing. When he confronted Meghan the next morning, she brushed it off once again, claiming she had lent it to a stylist for safekeeping during a recent shoot. Harry wanted to believe her. He needed to believe her. But her tone carried a sharpness that unsettled him, a defensiveness that felt rehearsed. Suspicion soon began to infiltrate even the ordinary rhythms of their days. At dinner, Harry caught himself studying Meghan's expression, wondering what thoughts ran behind her practiced smile. When she left the room to take a call, he strained to catch snippets of conversation. Trust, once fractured, cannot be repaired with words alone. It requires proof, and proof was slipping further from his grasp. The whispers also began to reach the outside world. A tabloid in the UK ran a small, speculative piece hinting that Diana's jewelry collection had been re-evaluated for insurance purposes. To most readers, it was meaningless, but to Harry it was a red flag. He had not ordered any re-evaluation. Who had? The timing was too precise to ignore. By now, Harry's heart and mind were at war. His heart wanted to shield Meghan, to protect her from the criticism she had endured since joining his life. He knew how vicious the press could be, but his mind replayed the missing bracelet, the hushed calls, the evasive answers. Could he have married someone who would betray the deepest part of his soul? Could love blind him so completely? The turning point of suspicion came when a former staffer, dismissed months earlier, reached out through an intermediary. The staffer claimed to have seen Meghan meeting discreetly with a known jewelry appraiser in Los Angeles. The meeting, held in a private suite at a hotel, had raised eyebrows because of the secrecy surrounding it. The appraiser was known for connecting wealthy collectors with rare pieces, often through back channels. When Harry heard this, the whisper of suspicion became a roar. It was no longer just missing pieces, it was the possibility of intent. Yet even then, Harry did not act rashly. He needed to be sure. The fear of accusing his wife falsely, of repeating the same cycles of paranoia he had despised in the palace, haunted him. So he stayed silent, watching, waiting, gathering fragments of evidence until he could no longer deny what was unfolding before him. Suspicion changes a household. The air grows heavier, conversations shorter, silences longer. In Montecito, the mansion that once echoed with laughter now seemed filled with invisible walls. Harry moved through its rooms like a man searching for answers in shadows, while Meghan carried on her public life with poise, giving no hint of the storm that was building behind closed doors. And so, the whispers became undeniable. The missing bracelet was not a fluke. The jewelry appraisals were not coincidences. Something was happening with Diana's treasures, something Harry could not ignore any longer. The stage was set for confrontation, for the clash between love and loyalty, between truth and denial. By the end of this chapter, Harry stood at a crossroads. Either the woman he loved had been misunderstood, the victim of malicious gossip, or she had been orchestrating something darker, something that cut to the very heart of his grief. And in that moment, Montecito was no longer a sanctuary. It was a crime scene waiting for revelation. Suspicion is one thing, but confirmation is another. Harry had lived for weeks with a gnawing unease, torn between his loyalty to Meghan and his devotion to the memory of his mother. He had endured the whispers, the rumors, the unexplained absences of certain jewelry pieces. But all of that remained speculation until the night he caught her in the act. That night, the fragile threads of trust finally snapped, and the truth he had tried so hard to deny stood before him like an open wound. It was a late evening in Montecito, the house dimly lit, the California air heavy with the scent of jasmine. Harry had returned home earlier than expected from a private dinner with a friend. Meghan had excused herself from joining, claiming she was tired, but when he walked through the door, the house did not feel asleep. There was movement, faint and deliberate, coming from the study where the vault was located. Harry's pulse quickened. For months he had tried to quiet his doubts, but now, hearing the sound of hushed voices in what should have been an empty room, his instincts sharpened. Moving quietly down the hallway, Harry stopped just short of the study door, which was ajar. Through the crack he could see Meghan, her posture elegant but tense, seated across from a man he did not immediately recognize. On the desk between them lay a velvet tray, and on that tray glimmered pieces Harry knew too well. His heart jolted when his eyes fell upon Diana's gold bracelet, the one he had not been able to find for weeks. The man, middle-aged with the polished demeanor of a professional appraiser, leaned forward with a magnifying glass, inspecting the clasp, murmuring words Harry could not fully catch. But he heard enough, words like valuation, collector, and private buyer. Harry froze. It was as though the air had been sucked from his lungs. His first instinct was denial. Perhaps this was legitimate. Perhaps Meghan had arranged for an appraisal to ensure proper insurance, something innocent. But then he caught the edge of her voice, low but unmistakable. Discretion is crucial. No one can know these pieces ever left the house. Those words shattered any remaining illusion. This was not insurance. This was not preservation. This was transaction. He pushed the door open, the sound echoing louder than he intended. Meghan's head snapped up, her expression a mixture of surprise and calculation. The man across from her shifted uncomfortably, clearly recognizing that he had stepped into something more personal than business. Harry's eyes locked onto the bracelet on the tray, then to Meghan. "What is this?" His voice cracked, raw with both fury and disbelief. Meghan's answer came too quickly, too smoothly. "Harry, it's not what it looks like. I was just having them appraised for safekeeping." But Harry had already heard enough to know the truth. The way her body stiffened, the way her tone faltered, betrayed her. He stepped closer, his hand trembling as he picked up the bracelet, holding it as though it were a piece of Diana herself. "Safekeeping," he repeated, his voice rising. "You told me this was with the stylist. You told me it was safe. And now I find you here, handing it over to a stranger in the middle of the night." The appraiser, sensing danger, quickly excused himself. Gathering his tools, he stammered an apology and slipped past Harry, leaving Meghan alone under the weight of his gaze. The silence that followed was suffocating. Harry placed the bracelet back on the tray with care, his hand shaking as if it burned him to touch it. "This was hers," he whispered. "My mother's. Do you understand what this means to me? How could you?" Meghan, cornered, shifted from denial to justification. "Harry, listen. We have responsibilities. We have expenses that no one else helps us with. Do you think Netflix and Spotify cover everything? Do you think we can live this life without making sacrifices? These jewels are symbols, yes, but they're also assets. Why should they sit locked away when they could give us the freedom we need?" Her tone was not pleading but firm, as if she believed her reasoning justified the act. Harry's face twisted with anguish. Freedom? That word echoed in his mind like a cruel irony. He had left everything behind for freedom, his titles, his country, his family. But what freedom was there in selling off the last pieces of his mother? "They're not assets," he spat. "They're her. They're all I have left of her. And you." His voice broke, his body trembling with rage. "You're turning her memory into a marketplace." The confrontation escalated, voices carrying through the mansion. Meghan insisted she had acted with good intentions, that she was only thinking of their future, of their children. But Harry saw only betrayal. Every explanation sounded hollow, every word a deeper wound. He replayed in his mind the countless times Meghan had invoked Diana's name in interviews, drawing parallels between their lives. And now, that same legacy was being bartered away in secret meetings. By the end of that night, Harry's world had cracked. He had walked in on the unthinkable. The woman he had sacrificed everything for caught negotiating over the most sacred treasures of his life. The jewelry, sitting exposed on the velvet tray, seemed to gleam with accusation. The ghosts of his past had collided with the reality of his present, and the sanctuary of Montecito now felt like a stage for betrayal. From that moment, the story was no longer about whispers or suspicion. It was about evidence. It was about a prince who could no longer deny that the woman he trusted most had crossed a line he could never forgive. And as he stood there, holding Diana's bracelet in his hand, Harry knew that the bond between him and Meghan had shifted forever. The question was no longer whether something had been lost. It was whether anything could ever be recovered. The moment of discovery is one thing, but the confrontation that follows is where wounds truly bleed. For Harry, catching Meghan in the act of appraising Diana's jewelry was not just an observation. It was a rupture. In the silence that lingered after the appraiser left the house, every suppressed doubt, every unspoken fear, surged to the surface. This was no longer suspicion. This was betrayal staring him in the face, and the weight of it pressed down on him like a storm he could no longer hold back. Harry's first words after the man left the study were not angry shouts, but broken questions, sharp in their simplicity. "Why, Meghan? Why would you do this?" His voice was not the roar of a prince, but the trembling of a son, a man standing at the edge of losing both his past and his present. He held the bracelet again in his palm, staring at it, as if hoping it would give him answers. Meghan's response was immediate but defensive. She insisted it wasn't what it looked like, repeating her claim that she was only having them appraised. But Harry pressed, his voice rising. At midnight? With a stranger in our home? After you lied to me about where it was? The question sliced the air between them, leaving Meghan momentarily without words. Her composure returned quickly, but it was laced with sharpness. Harry, you don't understand the pressures we're under. You think because you've lived with these pieces your whole life, they're untouchable. But we have responsibilities here. We're not protected by your family anymore. Do you have any idea how much it costs to keep this house running, to pay the security, to keep up with the life we're expected to maintain? Her tone carried the edge of justification, as though necessity excused secrecy. Harry shook his head, his hands tightening around the bracelet until his knuckles whitened. Responsibilities? You think this is about money? This is about my mother. These pieces aren't yours to barter. They aren't assets to be liquidated. They're her. They're the only things left that connect me to her. His voice cracked, the years of grief flooding back with the force of a wave. For a moment, he was not the Duke of Sussex or the man who had built a new life in California. He was the boy walking behind Diana's coffin, clutching memories that slipped further away with every step. Meghan, sensing his vulnerability, tried to pivot. She stepped closer, her tone softening. Harry, I'm not your enemy. I wear these pieces because I love you, because I want to honor her. But we can't live in the past forever. Your mother would want us to survive, to thrive. Isn't it better that these jewels help us build a future for Archie and Lilibet instead of gathering dust in a vault? She reached out to touch his arm, but he pulled back, his eyes burning with tears. Her words might have swayed another man, but for Harry, they felt like sacrilege. To frame his mother's memory as an instrument of survival was unthinkable. He had given Meghan everything, his protection, his loyalty, his distance from his family, and now she was asking him to surrender his mother as well. His grief hardened into anger. Don't you dare tell me what my mother would have wanted. You didn't know her. You never sat in her arms when the world turned its back on her. You never watched her cry behind palace doors. These jewels are not just stones, Meghan. They're her laughter, her strength, her love. And you're trying to sell them off like trinkets. The confrontation escalated through the night. Their voices echoed through the Montecito mansion, breaking the carefully cultivated silence that usually surrounded them. Staff, though trained to stay discreet, could not help but overhear fragments. Harry's fury, Meghan's defenses, the crash of something thrown against a wall. It was a battle not only of perspectives, but of identities. Meghan fought from a place of pragmatism, insisting she was acting in their best interest. Harry fought from a place of pain, demanding she understand the depth of what she had desecrated. At one point, Harry asked the question that cut deeper than any accusation. If you could sell my mother's memory, what else would you sell? The words hung heavy in the air, echoing louder than his shouts. Meghan did not answer immediately, her silence a louder reply than any denial. For Harry, that pause was damning. It was the moment he realized the woman he had stood by against his family might not have been standing by him at all. By the time dawn broke over Montecito, the confrontation had exhausted them both. Meghan retreated to her private quarters. Harry sat alone in the study, the bracelet still clutched in his hand. The sun illuminated the jewels on the velvet tray, making them gleam with an almost cruel brilliance. To Harry, they looked less like treasures and more like accusations, each stone a reminder of what had been broken. This confrontation was not just an argument between husband and wife. It was a clash between love and legacy, between grief and ambition. For Harry, it marked the point of no return. He could no longer ignore what was happening, no longer excuse away the whispers or the rumors. The confrontation had forced the truth into the open, and though Meghan still denied any wrongdoing, Harry's heart knew otherwise. From that morning onward, the house in Montecito no longer felt like home. Every glance between them was loaded with unspoken words, every silence heavy with resentment. Trust, once shattered, cannot be pieced back together by apologies. The confrontation had opened a wound that would only deepen in the days ahead, leading to decisions neither of them could undo. The fallout from Harry's confrontation with Meghan did not remain contained within the walls of Montecito for long. Secrets, especially royal secrets, have a way of slipping through cracks no matter how tightly guarded. And when whispers reached London that pieces of Diana's jewelry might have been mishandled, the reactions from within the royal family were swift, sharp, and filled with quiet fury. For Harry, it was the nightmare he had always feared, that the family he left behind would now see his choices not only as reckless but as disgraceful. The first to react, according to accounts that filtered through courtiers and confidants, was William. As Diana's elder son, William had always carried the greater portion of responsibility for her legacy. He had received the engagement ring, the iconic sapphire, and had ensured Catherine wore it proudly, a symbol of continuity and respect. To him, Diana's jewels were not mere heirlooms, but family trust, symbols of memory that demanded reverence. When William heard that Meghan was allegedly selling off pieces, his response was not tempered by diplomacy. Behind palace doors, he was said to be furious. He reportedly told close advisors that this was an unforgivable violation, a betrayal of their mother's memory. William's anger was not only about the jewels themselves. It was about the larger message. If Meghan could treat Diana's treasures as commodities, what did that say about the respect she had for Diana at all? And worse, what did it say about Harry, who had entrusted her with them? Their relationship, already strained by years of public feuding, seemed to reach another breaking point. William, according to palace whispers, made it clear that there would be no reconciliation with his brother so long as Meghan remained at the center of his life. King Charles, though more measured in his response, was no less troubled. For Charles, Diana's memory remained both a source of guilt and a political challenge. He had spent decades trying to rehabilitate his image after their bitter divorce and her tragic death. The jewelry represented part of that complex history. To hear that Meghan might have attempted to sell them was not only painful, it was dangerous. It opened the door for fresh criticism of the monarchy, fresh accusations that Diana's legacy was being mishandled by those who had married into the family. Behind the polished walls of Clarence House, Charles reportedly ordered his advisors to monitor the situation closely, concerned not just about the jewels, but about the public relations catastrophe it might spark if proven true. Camilla's reaction was more complicated. As the woman who had once been at the heart of Diana's heartbreak, her opinion carried a shadowed weight. Some reports suggested she viewed the scandal with quiet satisfaction, seeing in it a confirmation of her long-standing suspicions about Meghan's intentions. Others suggested she was more pragmatic, advising Charles that the family should stay silent publicly, allowing Meghan's own actions to speak against her. Whatever her private thoughts, Camilla remained outwardly composed, but her influence over Charles in such matters was undeniable. Even extended members of the family, often silent in public, were said to be alarmed. Princess Anne, known for her bluntness, was rumored to have dismissed Meghan's actions as self-serving nonsense. Sophie, the Duchess of Edinburgh, reportedly expressed sympathy for Harry but also frustration, telling confidants that he had placed himself in this situation by giving Meghan such access in the first place. The family, fractured though it was, seemed united in one thing: that Diana's jewelry was sacred, and that its alleged mishandling by Meghan was intolerable. Outside the family, the courtiers, the invisible machinery of the monarchy, took their cues from the top. Palace staff began quietly preparing for the possibility of public fallout. They reviewed Diana's jewelry inventory, cataloging what was known to remain in royal possession versus what had gone to her sons. There was talk of discreetly reclaiming certain pieces, though legally it was complicated, as Diana had willed items to her sons individually. But the monarchy is built on perception as much as law, and perception demanded that Diana's memory not be tarnished by scandal. Harry, meanwhile, was caught between two worlds once again. For years he had fought to protect Meghan against the family he believed had mistreated her. Now he found himself defending his mother's memory against the woman he had fought for. He knew word of the confrontation would travel back to London, and he braced for the inevitable backlash. His phone buzzed with messages from family intermediaries, short, sharp notes reminding him of his duty, questioning his judgment, hinting that his choices were now bringing dishonor to Diana herself. The reaction from the royal family added layers of pressure to an already broken household. Meghan, feeling cornered, doubled down on her defense. She argued that the jewels were given to Harry, and therefore theirs to use as they wished. To her, The family's outrage was hypocrisy. After all, the royals had long used Diana's memory for their own purposes. Harry, however, could not be swayed. The fury in William's voice when they last spoke about the matter echoed in his mind, alongside the cold warnings from Charles's advisors. He was isolated, abandoned by the family he left behind, and betrayed by the woman he had chosen instead. In many ways, this was the moment the scandal ceased to be personal and became global. The royals in London, Meghan in Montecito, Harry caught in the middle, each side wrestling with Diana's ghost. The jewelry was no longer just stones set in gold. It had become a battlefield where loyalty, memory, and identity collided. By the end of this chapter, one truth was clear. The royal family's reaction was not simply about jewels. It was about legacy, about control, about the narrative of Diana's memory. Meghan's alleged actions had reignited old wounds, pitting brother against brother, family against family, and leaving Harry adrift in a storm he could no longer escape. When word of the scandal finally seeped into the public domain, it did not arrive quietly. It arrived with the roar of headlines, the flash of paparazzi bulbs, and the relentless churn of social media commentary. The British tabloids, long obsessed with Harry and Meghan, seized upon the story with glee. "Meghan caught selling Diana's jewels," screamed one front page. Another splashed photos of Meghan wearing Diana's aquamarine ring beside a headline asking whether it had been appraised for sale. The narrative quickly spiraled from whispers in Montecito to an international firestorm. The press has always thrived on drama, but scandals involving Diana's memory carry a unique electricity. For decades, Diana had been the media's tragic saint, and the jewels she once wore had become sacred relics in the public imagination. To suggest that Meghan, already controversial in the eyes of the British press, had tried to profit from those relics was too sensational to resist. Commentators lined up on morning television to condemn her, to question Harry's judgment, and to speculate about what this meant for the monarchy. Every outlet found its angle: betrayal, greed, desperation, or the tragic unraveling of a once fairy tale romance. Social media, however, was even more brutal. Hashtags began trending within hours. Hashtag Diana's jewels. Hashtag betrayal in Montecito. Hashtag Meghan exposed. Supporters and detractors clashed online with ferocity. Meghan's critics framed the story as proof of what they had always suspected: that she was a manipulator, someone who had used Harry and Diana's legacy for her own advancement. Her supporters, though fewer in number during this wave, argued that the story was another manufactured smear campaign designed to vilify a woman of color who dared to challenge the monarchy. The debate was toxic, and Harry found himself at the center of a storm that seemed to strip away every ounce of privacy he had left. News outlets in America also joined in. While the coverage was less venomous than in the UK, it was no less relentless. Talk shows speculated about what the scandal meant for Harry and Meghan's Hollywood relationships. Gossip magazines ran spreads of Meghan at events wearing Diana's pieces, with captions questioning whether those jewels were still in her possession. Financial publications even weighed in, analyzing the potential market value of Diana's collection and what kind of buyers might be interested if such items ever came up for sale. It was as though the entire world had turned Diana's jewelry into the centerpiece of a global auction, an auction being debated in public while Harry's private life collapsed in silence. For Harry, the media storm was a cruel irony. He had left the monarchy, in part, to protect Meghan from the relentless press that had hounded his mother. And now, despite all his efforts, he found himself once again powerless against headlines that tore into the very heart of his family. The paparazzi even swarmed Montecito, drones buzzing over the mansion, long lenses aimed at the gates, hoping to capture a glimpse of Meghan leaving or Harry in visible distress. Neighbors complained, but the frenzy only grew. Montecito was no longer a refuge. It was a stage upon which their most painful drama was being broadcast to the world. The media also dredged up old wounds. Clips resurfaced of Meghan in interviews speaking reverently of Diana, drawing parallels between their struggles. These clips were now juxtaposed with headlines about betrayal, painting her as hypocritical. Analysts replayed moments when Meghan wore Diana's butterfly earrings or aquamarine ring, asking pointedly whether those appearances were genuine tributes or carefully calculated steps in a long con. The contrast between her words and the allegations became fodder for endless speculation. Even late-night comedians could not resist. Jokes about Montecito pawn shops and royal yard sales began making rounds, amplifying Harry's humiliation. For a man who had fought tirelessly to protect his mother's legacy, the ridicule was almost unbearable. He retreated further into himself, refusing to appear in public while Meghan continued to be the focal point of every camera lens. But perhaps the most devastating part of the media storm was its impact on Harry's relationship with the public. For years, he had been seen as Diana's son, the boy who walked behind her coffin, the prince who carried her spirit into a new era. That image, once unshakable, now seemed fractured. Commentators asked whether Harry had been blind, whether his devotion to Meghan had clouded his judgment to the point that he allowed his mother's legacy to be exploited. The sympathy that once surrounded him began to fade, replaced by pity, skepticism, and even scorn. Through it all, Meghan remained largely silent. Her team issued a short statement denying any wrongdoing, framing the story as baseless speculation designed to distract from her charitable work. But silence in the face of scandal rarely quells a storm. Instead, it fuels it. Every unanswered question became a headline, every gap in the narrative filled by imagination. And while Meghan tried to project composure in public, insiders whispered that behind the scenes she was furious. Furious at Harry for confronting her, furious at the leaks that had reached London, and furious at a press machine she believed had always been determined to destroy her. By the end of this chapter, the world was no longer just watching, it was judging. The media storm had taken what began as a private wound and turned it into a public spectacle. Diana's jewelry was no longer hidden in a vault or quietly appraised in a study. It was splashed across newspapers, dissected on talk shows, mocked in monologues, and debated in living rooms across the globe. And at the center of it all stood Harry, torn between the woman he loved and the mother he mourned, powerless once again against a media frenzy that thrived on his pain. The storm that erupted in the media did not only fracture Harry and Meghan's relationship with the public, it seeped into their personal lives, altering friendships that had once seemed unshakable. In the rarefied world of Montecito and Hollywood, allies can vanish overnight when scandal strikes. Meghan had built her new life in California on a network of celebrity connections, brand partnerships, and carefully chosen allies. But as the story of Diana's jewelry swirled, those connections began to falter, and the people who once stood beside her now began to pull away. In the beginning, Meghan had been embraced by the elite circles of Los Angeles and beyond. Oprah Winfrey lived just down the road, offering her home as the backdrop for that bombshell interview, which reshaped how the world viewed the Sussexes. Tyler Perry had lent them his mansion and his protection during their early days in America. Serena Williams had been a loyal friend, speaking warmly of Meghan's resilience. These relationships formed the backbone of Meghan's new identity as a woman not bound by the monarchy, but celebrated by Hollywood. Yet, when the jewelry scandal broke, silence from these quarters was deafening. Tyler Perry, who had once called Meghan family, was rumored to be uneasy. Reports suggested that he had distanced himself, no longer hosting dinners or publicizing their connection. Oprah, ever careful about her reputation, made no public comment at all. For someone as influential as Oprah, silence itself was commentary. Serena Williams, who had often defended Meghan against critics, posted cheerful updates on social media, but conspicuously avoided mentioning Meghan during the height of the scandal. These absences did not go unnoticed. For Meghan, who thrived on public affirmation, the withdrawal of her closest allies felt like betrayal layered atop betrayal. Even beyond the celebrity circle, whispers began to emerge from those who had once been part of Meghan's inner world. Former acquaintances from her acting career resurfaced with stories that painted her in a calculating light. Old colleagues spoke of her ambition, her careful networking, her ability to charm when it suited her. These recollections were now framed against the jewelry scandal, reinforcing the idea that Meghan had always been playing a long game, and that Diana's jewels were simply another move in that strategy. Whether these stories were fair or exaggerated no longer mattered. In the court of public opinion, they were fuel for the fire. Harry felt the shift as well. His own friendships, already strained by his decision to leave the monarchy, began to fray further. Friends from his military years, men who had once admired his loyalty and courage, now whispered doubts. Some reached out privately, questioning whether Meghan had truly betrayed him or whether he was complicit. Others avoided him altogether, unwilling to be drawn into the drama. For a man who had always cherished loyalty above all, these cracks were devastating. What made the unraveling of friendships more painful was how quickly it happened. In the glittering world Meghan had cultivated, loyalty was often conditional. As soon as her image shifted from survivor to potential betrayer, invitations stopped coming. Business associates hesitated to sign deals. Charitable partners grew cautious about attaching their names to her projects. Every opportunity she had built in California seemed suddenly fragile, as though the ground beneath her had given way. Meghan, true to form, did not go quietly. Behind closed doors, she raged at the hypocrisy of it all. She reminded Harry, and anyone who would listen, that these same people had once celebrated her, praised her resilience, and leaned on her story for their own publicity. Now, when she needed them, they were silent. She saw it as abandonment, a confirmation of her long-held suspicion that friendship in Hollywood was fickle and self-serving. Yet, in public, she remained composed, refusing to admit the isolation closing in around her. Harry, meanwhile, saw the shift through a different lens. He had warned Meghan many times that celebrity friendships were transactional, that the glitz of Hollywood was not the same as the loyalty of true allies. Watching her connections evaporate only reinforced his fears that she had built their life on unstable foundations. Each former ally who turned away felt like another blow to the fragile trust between them. And each story from Meghan's past that resurfaced reminded him of how little he truly understood the woman he had given up his world for. The contrast between their perspectives deepened the gulf in their marriage. Meghan saw herself as the victim of betrayal by friends and allies. Harry saw the scandal as proof that her strategy of using people, and now perhaps using his mother's jewelry, was unraveling. Their arguments grew sharper, their silences longer. In those silences, the absence of friends became even more pronounced. Where once their mansion had been filled with laughter, visits, and high-profile gatherings, it now echoed with emptiness. By the time the dust of the media storm settled slightly, Meghan's circle was noticeably smaller. The people who had once stood beside her in photos, interviews, and public statements were now distant memories. In their absence, Meghan's isolation grew, and so did her reliance on Harry, the very man whose trust she had already fractured. For Harry, this dependence felt less like love and more like entrapment, as though he was being asked to carry the weight of her world even as his own collapsed. By the end of this chapter, one thing had become clear. The scandal had not only exposed cracks within Harry and Meghan's marriage, but had also shattered the illusion of unwavering support from the world around them. Friends had turned to foes, allies to silence, and the very community Meghan had relied upon to define her new life in America had retreated when scandal struck. What remained was a couple increasingly isolated, surrounded not by friends but by whispers, and facing the storm largely alone. There comes a moment in every unraveling when the weight of silence becomes heavier than the storm itself. For Harry, that moment arrived in the weeks after the scandal erupted. He had endured the confrontation, the royal family's fury, the media circus, and the collapse of friendships. But it was the slow, gnawing realization that he could no longer trust the woman he once defended at all costs that drove him to his breaking point. The Harry who had walked away from the monarchy to protect his wife was now a man who could barely protect himself from the grief clawing at him day and night. At first, he tried to bury himself in routine. Early morning runs along the beach, long hours in his study, phone calls to advisors about ongoing projects. He clung to the semblance of normalcy. But normalcy requires peace, and peace was a luxury he no longer had. Every time he looked at the vault, at the jewelry he had pulled from Meghan's hands that night, the memories of Diana surged back. He saw her face, not in glossy photographs, but in the raw flashes of his childhood. Her smile when she tucked him into bed, her tears when she felt trapped by the institution, her warmth when the world turned cold. The jewels were not just objects. They were his mother's presents, and now they had been tainted by betrayal. Harry began calling William late at night. Their conversations were strained, brittle, often ending in silence. William, still furious, did not offer comfort. Instead, he asked pointed questions Harry could not answer. How could you let her near them? How could you not see this coming? The words cut deeply, reinforcing Harry's sense of failure. It was not only his marriage that was collapsing, it was his bond with his brother, perhaps permanently. He reached out to old military friends, hoping for camaraderie, but the conversations felt hollow. They offered sympathy, but could not understand the depth of what he was facing. Alone in Montecito, Harry found himself haunted by echoes of the past. He revisited footage of Diana, interviews where she spoke of feeling used, isolated, betrayed. The parallels with his own life struck him like cruel reminders. Was history repeating itself, not through the institution, but through his own choices? Was the woman he loved mirroring the very exploitation his mother had endured? These questions festered in him until sleep became impossible. He roamed the house at night, restless, consumed by what-ifs. One evening, overwhelmed, Harry turned to therapy, a lifeline he had leaned on before. He poured out his grief to a trusted counselor, speaking not as a prince, but as a broken son. He described the confrontation, the bracelet, the whispers, the isolation. His therapist asked him gently what he feared most. Harry's answer was immediate, that I've lost her again, that I let someone take my mother from me a second time. The words hung in the air, and for the first time, Harry recognized that the scandal was not just about Meghan's actions. It was about the deep wound Diana's death had left unhealed in him. But recognition did not ease the pain. If anything, it deepened it. He began to pull away from Meghan completely, retreating into himself. Meals were eaten in silence, conversations reduced to curt exchanges. Meghan tried to bridge the gap, alternating between apologies and justifications, but nothing landed. Harry's eyes no longer softened when he looked at her. They hardened, filled with a mixture of sorrow and anger. She had once been his refuge from the coldness of the palace. Now she was the source of his torment. In his lowest moments, Harry considered leaving Montecito altogether. He fantasized about taking his children and disappearing into anonymity, perhaps in Africa, a place that had always brought him solace. But the reality of his situation made such dreams impossible. His life was too entangled in contracts, security needs, and relentless scrutiny. The very freedom he had sought when leaving the monarchy now felt further away than ever. The breaking point arrived one night when Harry sat alone in the study, staring at Diana's aquamarine ring. He had pulled it from the vault, holding it as if it were a lifeline. Tears streamed down his face as he whispered aloud, "I can't do this anymore, Mom. I can't carry this weight." The ring glittered under the lamplight, a cruel reminder that the woman he longed to speak to could never answer. For hours, he sat in silence, clutching the ring, his grief spiraling into despair. The following morning, Harry's demeanor had changed. Something inside him had snapped, not in rage but in resolve. He no longer raised his voice at Meghan. He no longer argued. Instead, he became cold, detached, a man whose love had calcified into distance. This emotional withdrawal was more devastating than anger. Meghan, accustomed to defending herself against accusations, now found herself battling silence. And silence, she soon realized, was harder to fight than words. By this stage, Harry had stopped confiding in Meghan entirely. His phone calls were private, his movements deliberate. He made arrangements with his legal team, began discreet inquiries into the ownership and insurance of the jewelry, and even reached out to trustees who had once overseen Diana's estate. It was as though he was preparing for a reckoning, not only with Meghan but with himself. By the end of this chapter, Harry was no longer the man who had stood defiantly beside Meghan against the monarchy. He was a man stripped of illusions, broken by grief, and hardened by betrayal. His breaking point had not been a single moment, but a culmination of wounds too heavy to bear. And now, with his silence louder than any accusation, the stage was set for the inevitable decision, to end not only the scandal but the marriage itself. The moment Harry finally told Meghan to leave Montecito did not come in a single burst of rage, but in a quiet, devastating decision that had been building for weeks. The silence between them had grown unbearable, the distance impossible to bridge. Harry's breaking point had stripped him of illusions, and what remained was a man resolved to protect the last fragments of his mother's memory, even if it meant destroying the life he had once sacrificed everything to build. The day began like any other. The California sun streamed through the wide windows, casting golden light across the marble floors of the mansion. Yet inside, the atmosphere was heavy, tense, suffocating. Harry had spent the morning in the study, staring at the velvet cases that held Diana's jewels. He had taken them out one by one, examining them as if to reassure himself that they were still there, still untouched. Each piece felt like a verdict, each jewel a reminder of the line Meghan had crossed. By the time he returned them to the vault, his decision was made. When Meghan entered the room that afternoon, she found him sitting in silence, his eyes hollow but steady. He did not shout. He did not rage. Instead, his voice was flat, almost devoid of emotion, when he said, "You need to leave." The words hit like a thunderclap, though they were spoken softly. Meghan froze, stunned. "What are you talking about?" she demanded, her tone sharp with disbelief. Harry repeated himself, firmer this time. "I want you out of this house. Today." His hands trembled slightly, but his resolve did not falter. Meghan tried to laugh it off at first, as though he were bluffing, but when she looked into his eyes, she saw no trace of the man who had once defended her against the world. His expression was cold, resolute, unmovable. "What about the children?" she asked, her voice breaking. Harry's reply was immediate. "They stay with me. This is their home. You've already taken too much from me. I won't let you take them too." The words cut sharply, drawing a line in the sand. Meghan's composure cracked. She protested, accused him of betrayal, insisted that he was abandoning her after everything they had endured together. But Harry remained unmoved. Years of loyalty, of sacrifice, of standing by her side had given way to one truth he could not deny. Trust, once shattered, could not be rebuilt. The scene that followed was both surreal and devastating. Meghan, realizing Harry would not bend, stormed through the mansion, gathering her belongings in a fury. Staff, caught between duty and discomfort, moved hesitantly to assist her, their eyes downcast. Wordlessly, security was instructed to prepare vehicles for her departure. Neighbors, always alert to unusual activity, noticed the sudden bustle at the gates. Some even claimed they saw Meghan leaving, her face hidden behind oversized sunglasses, her body language rigid with anger and humiliation. Inside, Harry remained in the study, refusing to watch her leave. He could not bear to see the woman he had once loved so fiercely reduced to this moment of exile. Instead, he sat with Diana's bracelet in his hand, the same piece that had exposed the truth weeks earlier. To him, it was not just jewelry. It was the anchor of his decision, the proof that his loyalty to his mother had finally outweighed his loyalty to his wife. Meghan's departure was not accompanied by shouting or grand theatrics. It was quiet, subdued, marked by the dull thud of bags being loaded into cars and the creak of the heavy gates opening and closing. Yet the silence was more powerful than any explosion. When the last car disappeared down the winding Montecito road, the mansion seemed to exhale, empty and cavernous. Harry sat alone, surrounded by ghosts. The sanctuary he had built for love was now a mausoleum of betrayal. In the hours that followed, the news inevitably spread. Neighbors whispered to friends, staff shared careful details with contacts, and soon the tabloids were buzzing with reports that Meghan had been seen leaving the Montecito estate in haste. Photos emerged of vehicles speeding down the highway, fueling speculation that the rift between Harry and Meghan had reached a breaking point. Commentators debated whether this was a temporary separation or the end of their marriage entirely. For Harry, there was no debate. The expulsion was final. What made the moment so poignant was not the drama of it, but its stillness. After years of public battles, televised interviews, and explosive headlines, the end came quietly, like a door closing in the middle of the day. Harry did not triumph in that moment. He mourned. He mourned the loss of the woman he thought Meghan was, the dream of a life they had built together, and the hope that Diana's legacy could have been a source of unity rather than destruction. That night, Harry walked through the empty rooms of the Montecito mansion, the silence pressing against him from every side. He paused in the children's rooms, watching them sleep, their small faces untouched by the chaos that had engulfed their parents. He whispered promises to them, that he would protect them, that he would never let them feel the same loneliness he had felt when his mother was taken from him. Yet as he closed their doors softly, he knew those promises would be tested in the days ahead. The expulsion of Meghan from Montecito was not just the end of a marriage. It was the culmination of a story that began decades earlier, when a young boy lost his mother and vowed to protect her memory at all costs. In choosing to send Meghan away, Harry was not simply acting as a husband betrayed. He was acting as a son, reclaiming the legacy of Diana from what he saw as exploitation. The cost of that choice was immense, leaving him isolated, wounded, and uncertain of the future. By the end of this chapter, the image of Montecito had transformed entirely. Once a palace of freedom, it was now a fortress of solitude. Once a symbol of triumph over the monarchy, it was now a monument to love undone by greed and mistrust. The gates that had opened to welcome Meghan years earlier had closed behind her with finality, and Harry was left standing in the shadow of both his past and his present, unsure of what redemption, if any, might come next. The days after Meghan's departure from Montecito were marked by a silence that felt heavier than the chaos that had preceded it. For Harry, the act of telling her to leave had been decisive, final, but the aftermath was anything but clean. The house, once filled with the noise of arguments and the hum of activity, now echoed with an eerie stillness. Each room seemed larger, emptier, as though the walls themselves had absorbed the tension of the past months and were now left hollow. Harry spent those first days in a haze. He rose early, wandering the grounds aimlessly, staring out at the Pacific Ocean as though it might offer him answers. At night, he returned to the vault, checking the jewelry again and again, reassuring himself that nothing more had been taken. But each visit only reopened the wound. The pieces sat silently in their cases, gleaming under artificial light, a reminder of both his mother's presence and his wife's betrayal. The objects that had once comforted him now felt like anchors, dragging him into grief deeper than before. The fallout was immediate and widespread. Within hours of Meghan leaving, paparazzi stationed near the Montecito estate captured images of convoys of cars leaving the gates. The photographs splashed across tabloids worldwide. Meghan's face partially hidden, Harry unseen but imagined, the narrative written for them. End of the fairy tale, screamed one headline. Montecito meltdown, declared another. For a public long accustomed to seeing Harry and Meghan as a pair, the image of separation was explosive. Harry could not avoid the media coverage, no matter how hard he tried. Every time he turned on the television or glanced at his phone, his private life stared back at him. Commentators debated whether the marriage was over, whether Meghan would return, whether the children would be caught in a custody battle. Some analysts claimed Harry had finally chosen loyalty to his mother over loyalty to his wife. Others painted him as a broken man, once again manipulated by forces beyond his control. The speculation was endless, and Harry had no voice in it. Inside his own circle, reactions were mixed. A few close friends quietly reached out, offering sympathy and reminding him that he was not alone. But others, wary of being caught in the drama, kept their distance. Calls to his family in London remained strained. William, though still furious, softened slightly when he heard Meghan was gone, but the wounds between the brothers were too deep for reconciliation. Charles's advisors were already strategizing about how to use the scandal to the monarchy's advantage, while Charles himself remained publicly silent. To Harry, it felt like confirmation of what he had always believed, that in the royal world, everything, even personal tragedy, became a matter of optics. For Meghan, the fallout took on a different shape. While Harry retreated into silence, Meghan began to reappear in public. Photographers spotted her in Los Angeles, attending meetings, dining with acquaintances, presenting an image of composure. Her team issued carefully worded statements insisting that reports of her departure were exaggerated, that she was merely giving Harry space. Yet her actions suggested otherwise. Rumors circulated that she was already pursuing new projects, new alliances, perhaps even preparing to tell her side of the story. In Hollywood, reinvention is survival, and Meghan knew better than most how to shift narratives. But the damage was done. The trust between her and Harry was broken, and the world knew it. The couple who had once branded themselves as a modern love story had become a cautionary tale. Their carefully built empire, media deals, charitable endeavors, brand partnerships, suddenly seemed fragile. Companies that had once courted them with lucrative contracts began to hesitate, wary of attaching themselves to scandal. Invitations to high-profile events slowed, their celebrity allies remained quiet, and the image of the Sussexes as a power couple faded into uncertainty. Harry, meanwhile, faced the internal fallout of his decision. The loneliness of Montecito weighed heavily on him. Without Meghan, the house no longer felt alive, but it also no longer felt like a battlefield. The quiet was both relief and torment. He missed her presence even as he resented it, missed the idea of the love they once shared even as he knew it had been corrupted. He wrestled with guilt, guilt for expelling her, guilt for allowing the scandal to unfold, guilt for failing to protect the memory of his mother from exploitation. The children were the only steadying force in his days. Archie and Lilibet, too young to understand the complexities of betrayal and scandal, offered him moments of simplicity and love. Harry devoted himself to them, reading stories at bedtime, playing in the garden, holding them close as if to shield them from the chaos swirling around their family. In their innocence, he found fleeting comfort, a reminder that not everything had been lost. But the questions lingered. What would happen next? Would Meghan fight to return? Would she mount a public defense? Would the royal family use this as an opportunity to further isolate him? Each day felt like walking a tightrope, the future uncertain, the past too heavy to carry. By the end of this chapter, one truth was undeniable. The expulsion had not ended the storm. It had only shifted it. Harry was left in the aftermath, grappling with isolation, regret, and the unshakable weight of his mother's memory. Meghan, cast out from Montecito, faced her own reckoning in the court of public opinion. The fallout was not just personal. It was global, reshaping how the world saw them, and perhaps setting the stage for battles yet to come. When news of Meghan's expulsion from Montecito spread beyond California, the reaction was not confined to tabloids and social media alone. It became a global spectacle, dissected in every corner of the world, each culture and community interpreting the scandal through its own lens. This was not merely a celebrity falling out. It was a story tangled in royalty, legacy, betrayal, and grief. The entire world seemed to pause to weigh in on what had happened between Harry and Meghan, and by extension, what it meant for the memory of Diana. In the United Kingdom, the reaction was particularly fierce. For many Britons, Diana remains a sacred figure, the people's princess, whose tragic death had left an indelible scar. The suggestion that Meghan had tried to sell Diana's jewelry was taken not simply as a scandal, but as an affront to the nation's memory. Call-in radio shows buzzed with outrage, newspapers carried op-eds demanding answers, and commentators debated what this said about Meghan's character. On the streets of London, ordinary citizens expressed sympathy for Harry, describing him as a man caught in an endless cycle of heartbreak. For many, the scandal confirmed long-held suspicions that Meghan had not truly understood the weight of the royal legacy she had married into. Across Europe, the coverage carried its own flavor. In France, newspapers framed the scandal as a tragic love story collapsing under the burden of history. In Germany, the focus was on the financial aspect. Detailed analyses of the estimated worth of Diana's collection, the risks of selling such treasures on the black market, and what it revealed about the couple's financial pressures. In Spain and Italy, magazines leaned into the drama, likening the saga to a royal soap opera, complete with betrayal, exile, and fractured loyalties. In the United States, the reaction was more complicated. While British media leaned heavily into condemnation, American outlets were divided. Some commentators criticized Meghan harshly, portraying her as greedy and manipulative. Others defended her, insisting that the story was exaggerated, that she was being targeted yet again by a hostile press determined to vilify her. Talk shows featured heated debates, with audiences split between those who saw Harry as a man finally reclaiming his dignity and those who viewed Meghan as unfairly maligned. Hollywood, however, remained cautious. Invitations dwindled, partnerships slowed, and the silence of her high-profile allies spoke volumes. In the Commonwealth nations, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. The story sparked broader conversations about the monarchy itself. Many citizens questioned why Diana's memory still held so much sway, why her jewelry carried such symbolic power. Some used the scandal to argue that the monarchy was outdated, clinging to relics of the past. Others, however, rallied around Harry, expressing empathy for a man whose life seemed perpetually defined by tragedy. On social media, the global reaction played out in real time, with hashtags trending in multiple languages. In Japan, users compared the scandal to historical tales of royal betrayal, seeing it as part of a larger human pattern. In India, commentators drew parallels to cultural traditions where family heirlooms are considered sacred and selling them is taboo. In Africa, where Harry had often spoken about finding peace and purpose, reactions were tinged with disappointment, with many expressing sorrow that the man who had once seemed closest to his mother's humanitarian spirit was now mired in scandal and personal collapse. What united these diverse reactions was the sense that this story was bigger than Harry and Meghan themselves. It was about Diana, about the fragility of memory, about the way personal grief can become public property. The image of Harry sitting alone in Montecito, holding his mother's jewelry while Meghan was cast out, struck a universal chord. It was a scene that resonated far beyond royal watchers. It spoke to anyone who had ever felt betrayed, anyone who had ever clung to a loved one's memory, anyone who had ever faced the collapse of trust. Meanwhile, global institutions and experts weighed in as well. Jewelry historians explained the historical significance of Diana's collection, emphasizing that selling even a single piece would be akin to discarding a fragment of modern royal history. Psychologists offered commentary on Harry's state of mind, noting the unresolved grief he had carried since childhood and how it made him particularly vulnerable to betrayal. Financial analysts speculated about the pressures that might have driven Meghan to consider such actions, pointing to the couple's costly lifestyle and uncertain revenue streams. Each analysis added another layer to the global narrative, fueling discussions that seemed endless. For Harry, hearing the world debate his pain was agonizing. He had always hated the intrusion of the media into his personal life, and now his private heartbreak was the subject of conversations in homes, cafes, and newsrooms across the globe. Yet, in some ways, the global reaction offered him a strange kind of validation. The outrage, the sympathy, the sorrow, it all confirmed that Diana's memory still mattered, that the world still cared about protecting her legacy. In that sense, his painful decision to expel Meghan was not just personal, but symbolic, a gesture that resonated with millions. By the close of this chapter, one truth was clear. The scandal had transcended Harry and Meghan's marriage. It had become a global story, woven into cultural conversations about loyalty, legacy, and loss. The world had weighed in, and the verdict, though divided in its details, was united in its intensity. No corner of the globe was untouched by the tale of a prince, his wife, and the jewels that symbolized not only a mother's love but a world's grief. When the dust of scandal finally began to settle, what remained was not relief but ruin. The cost of betrayal is rarely measured in money alone. It carves itself into relationships, reputations, and the very fabric of trust. For Harry, the decision to cast Meghan out of Montecito brought with it a silence that was both liberating and suffocating. He had protected his mother's memory, but at what price? What he lost in the process was not just a marriage, but the sense of identity he had been clinging to since Diana's death. The first cost was personal. Harry found himself waking each day to a house that no longer echoed with Meghan's presence. Gone were the sounds of her voice, her laughter, her movements through the hallways. At first, this absence felt like a reprieve, a lifting of tension that had weighed heavily on him for months. But soon the silence transformed into loneliness. For years, he had defined himself as her protector, her partner, the man who had left behind duty to stand by her side. Without her, who was he? The jewelry remained locked in the vault, but the love that had once bound them lay in fragments around him. The second cost was his children's future. Though he kept them close in Montecito, the rupture with Meghan inevitably raised questions. How would Archie and Lilibet grow up in the shadow of this scandal? Would they remember their mother as the woman who had loved them, or would the world's narrative of betrayal shape their understanding of her? Harry worried constantly about what story his children would inherit. He wanted to shield them from the chaos, to keep them innocent, but he knew from painful experience how the press and public opinion could pierce even the most carefully constructed walls. Financially, the cost was staggering as well. The couple's brand, built on the promise of authenticity, love, and resilience, had been compromised. Companies hesitated to work with either of them, fearing backlash. Charitable projects slowed as donors grew wary. Harry's decision to expel Meghan may have restored his dignity in the eyes of some, but it also left their empire fractured. The very independence they had fought for seemed to be slipping away, replaced by uncertainty and instability. The betrayal also cost Harry his peace of mind. Trust, once broken, leaves scars that do not heal easily. He replayed every moment of their relationship in his head, searching for signs he had missed. Had Meghan shown this side of herself all along? Had he been blinded by love, by his desire to see her as the embodiment of his mother's spirit? The questions tormented him. Nights became long vigils of self-recrimination, days blurred into routines of distraction. The weight of betrayal was not just in what Meghan had done, but in what it revealed about his own vulnerability. For Meghan, the cost was equally profound, though in different ways. Cast out of Montecito, she faced a world that no longer saw her as the triumphant duchess but as a woman marked by scandal. The friends who had once celebrated her kept their distance. Business opportunities dwindled. Public sympathy, once her greatest weapon, had curdled into suspicion. She worked tirelessly to rebuild her image, to reclaim her narrative, but the shadow of the jewelry scandal followed her everywhere. The betrayal had not only cost her Harry's trust, it had cost her the very foundation of her reinvention in America. Globally, the cost of betrayal reverberated through the public consciousness. For supporters of Harry and Meghan, it was a moment of disillusionment. For critics, it was vindication. For the royal family, it was both an opportunity and a burden. The scandal reminded the world of Diana's legacy, reigniting old wounds, but it also reinforced the monarchy's narrative that Harry's choices had led him astray. In a cruel twist, Meghan's alleged actions gave the palace the very ammunition it had once lacked to discredit her fully. But perhaps the greatest cost was the intangible one, the erosion of hope. When Harry and Meghan had stood together years earlier, they represented something radical, the possibility of love conquering tradition, of two people forging their own path against impossible odds. For many around the world, they symbolized freedom, courage, and a break from the rigidity of monarchy. The scandal shattered that symbol. What remained was not a love story, but a cautionary tale, a reminder that even the most romantic of beginnings can end in bitterness and betrayal. Harry himself articulated this cost in a private moment that later leaked through confidence. "I thought I was saving her," he reportedly said. "But in the end, I was trying to save myself from losing Mum again. And now I've lost them both." Those words captured the essence of the tragedy, the way Diana's absence and Meghan's betrayal had fused into one unbearable weight. For Harry, the cost of betrayal was not only the end of his marriage but the confirmation of his deepest fear, that he could never truly escape the cycle of loss. By the end of this chapter, the full scope of the cost had become clear. It was not just about jewels, not just about scandal. It was about legacy, love, and the fragile human heart caught in the storm of history and ambition. Betrayal, once revealed, does not simply end a chapter. It rewrites the entire story. And for Harry, Meghan, and the world watching, the cost of this betrayal would linger long after the headlines faded, shaping how history would remember them all. The scandal had grown far beyond the walls of Montecito or the pages of tabloids. It had become a global conversation, a story that seemed to touch on something deeper than royalty or celebrity gossip. The betrayal over Diana's jewelry was not just about objects of gold and sapphire. It was about legacy, memory, trust, and the human tendency to project our own values onto public figures. As Harry and Meghan's private implosion became the world's entertainment, reactions poured in from every corner of society, each shaped by culture, politics, and personal experience. In Britain, the story struck at the very heart of national sentiment. Diana remains an almost sacred figure in the public consciousness, her image immortalized in murals, documentaries, and endless retellings of her tragic life. For many, the jewels were not just heirlooms, but relics of their collective grief. To suggest that Meghan had sought to sell them felt like sacrilege. On talk radio, callers voiced anger, demanding that Harry return to the UK and place the jewelry in a museum or foundation where it could be safeguarded for the people. Editorials in the press condemned Meghan outright, calling her actions a final insult to Diana's memory. At the same time, some voices urged caution, reminding readers that no proof had been publicly confirmed. But the tide of opinion was clear: sympathy for Harry, suspicion for Meghan, and renewed reverence for Diana. Across the Atlantic, Americans viewed the saga through a different lens. In the United States, where Meghan had crafted her reinvention, reactions were more divided. Some commentators criticized the media frenzy itself, arguing that Meghan was once again being targeted unfairly by a press that had always painted her as a villain. Others, however, felt betrayed by the image she had projected, a woman who claimed to honor Diana while allegedly undermining her legacy. On daytime television, pundits debated whether Meghan had been misunderstood or whether the jewelry scandal confirmed the worst suspicions about her. Among ordinary people, the story fueled passionate arguments at dinner tables, in classrooms, and on social media. The Sussexes were no longer just royals abroad. They were neighbors, celebrities, and symbols whose choices reflected broader themes of loyalty and ambition. In the Commonwealth nations, the scandal reignited old debates about the monarchy itself. In Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, headlines questioned why heirlooms tied to Diana had not been placed under stricter safeguards. For Republicans who sought to sever ties with the monarchy, the scandal was an opportunity to argue that such dramas were proof of an outdated institution. In Australia, one politician remarked, "If Diana's jewelry can be passed around, appraised, and nearly sold in secret, what does that say about the institution that claims to preserve history?" Yet others saw the incident not as a monarchy issue, but as a deeply personal tragedy, empathizing with Harry's impossible position between the woman he loved and the mother he still mourned. In other parts of the world, the reactions reflected cultural values. In India, commentators emphasized the sacredness of heirlooms, noting that selling family jewelry is often considered a last resort in times of desperation, and to do so with treasures of such symbolic weight was seen as dishonorable. In Africa, where Harry has long been admired for his charitable work and connection to the continent, there was a tone of disappointment. Newspapers in Kenya and South Africa expressed sorrow that a man once seen as carrying forward Diana's humanitarian spirit was now consumed by domestic betrayal. In Japan, the scandal was compared to tales of royal dishonor in ancient courts, framed as part of the universal human struggle between duty and desire. The academic world also weighed in. Historians of the monarchy explained that heirlooms like Diana's jewelry are not merely personal possessions, but cultural artifacts, symbols that carry meaning far beyond their material value. Psychologists analyzed the situation as an expression of unresolved grief, arguing that Harry's reaction was intensified by the trauma of losing his mother so young. Financial experts dissected the pressures of maintaining a Montecito lifestyle, suggesting that Meghan's alleged actions reflected desperation rather than greed. Every discipline seemed to find its own angle, turning Harry and Meghan's crisis into a case study. Meanwhile, ordinary people across the world projected their own lives onto the story. Mothers spoke of the importance of leaving something meaningful to their children, daughters reflected on how they would protect their parents' memories, and husbands admitted the devastation they would feel if their wives tampered with something sacred from their past. The scandal became a mirror, reflecting not just the flaws of public figures, but the fears and values of the people watching. For Harry, knowing the world was weighing in was both validating and suffocating. On one hand, the outrage confirmed what he already felt, that Diana's memory was worth defending at all costs. On the other, the scrutiny reminded him that he could never escape the burden of being Diana's son. His grief was once again public property, dissected by strangers, debated by pundits, judged by millions. For Meghan, the global reaction was equally crushing. Whatever her intentions, her reputation was stained, her every move cast in suspicion. No statement, no interview, No photograph could erase the association between her name and the betrayal of Diana's legacy. By the end of this chapter, the world had delivered its verdict, not in a single voice, but in a cacophony of perspectives. Some condemned Meghan outright, others sympathized, and still others saw the scandal as emblematic of larger issues, about monarchy, about memory, about the impossibility of living under the weight of history. But one thing was undeniable: the world was no longer neutral. It had chosen sides, and in doing so, it ensured that Harry and Meghan's story would never again be just theirs to tell. In the weeks that followed, the narrative shifted from scandal to reckoning. It was no longer just about missing jewelry or the collapse of a marriage. It was about what the scandal meant for the legacy of Diana, for Harry's identity, and for the future of a family already fractured by years of tension. A legacy once held up as a symbol of love, resilience, and rebellion against the monarchy now stood shrouded in controversy, its meaning contested and its sanctity questioned. For Harry, the realization came slowly but painfully. His attempt to preserve his mother's memory had led to an outcome she would have dreaded. Diana, who had longed for her children to be safe, united, and free from exploitation, was now the center of yet another storm. The jewelry that had once symbolized her grace and individuality was now tainted by whispers of betrayal and greed. Instead of strengthening his connection to her, Harry felt as though the scandal had stolen her from him all over again. He began to wonder if Diana's legacy had become too heavy to bear, too entangled in public perception to ever truly belong to him or William. The royal family, while privately satisfied that Meghan had been discredited, was also troubled by the broader implications. They knew that every scandal tied to Diana reopened old wounds in the public consciousness. It reminded the world of the monarchy's failures, of its coldness in the face of her suffering, of the role it played in her isolation. While Meghan took the brunt of the criticism this time, the palace could not fully escape the shadow cast by Diana's ghost. In their careful silence, in their strategic maneuvers, there was an unspoken acknowledgement. Diana's legacy would never be neat, never be controlled, and scandals like this ensured it remained volatile. William, meanwhile, was left with a bitter sense of vindication. For years he had warned Harry that his choices carried risks, that his loyalty to Meghan could cloud his judgment. The scandal seemed to prove him right. But vindication did not bring him peace. Instead, it hardened the walls between the brothers even further. William, protective of his portion of Diana's memory, resolved to guard it more fiercely than ever. The sapphire engagement ring on Catherine's finger became not just a symbol of continuity, but a bulwark against betrayal. He would not let what happened in Montecito touch his branch of the family. Meghan faced her own reckoning. Whatever her intentions had been, the scandal left her reputation in tatters. The brand she had built, an image of resilience, empowerment, and authenticity, was crumbling under the weight of suspicion. The whispers followed her everywhere, from Hollywood boardrooms to casual outings in Los Angeles. People no longer saw her as the Duchess who had broken free from the monarchy's grip, but as the woman who had allegedly tried to profit from its most sacred memory. She fought to rebuild, to present herself as misunderstood, but the stain was too deep. Every attempt at reinvention was met with skepticism, every public appearance dissected for ulterior motives. Globally, Diana's legacy itself was caught in the crossfire. Documentaries and news specials aired, re-examining her life, her jewelry, her impact. Some framed her as a tragic figure once again exploited by those around her. Others argued that the scandal underscored how enduring her memory was, that even decades after her death, her influence could ignite global debates. But for those who had cherished her memory quietly, privately, it felt like a desecration. The jewelry had been symbols of beauty, strength, and grace. Now they were reduced to talking points in a scandal that seemed to cheapen what Diana had represented. For Harry, the greatest tragedy was the impact on his children. He feared that Archie and Lilibet would grow up not with stories of their grandmother's warmth and courage, but with headlines about jewels and betrayal. He worried that they would inherit not a legacy of love, but a legacy of scandal. In his darkest moments, he questioned whether he had failed them before they were even old enough to understand. The thought consumed him, gnawing at him in the quiet hours of the night. The Montecito mansion, once intended as a sanctuary, became a mausoleum of broken dreams. Every hallway carried echoes of arguments, every room a reminder of what had been lost. Harry found himself increasingly isolated, consumed by memories of his mother and haunted by the choices he had made. He had won the battle to protect her jewelry, but the victory felt hollow. What good was preserving the physical remnants of her life if the meaning behind them had been tarnished? The legacy in shambles extended beyond Harry and Meghan. It became a lesson in the fragility of trust, the dangers of ambition, and the way history can be twisted when personal pain collides with public spectacle. For the world, it was entertainment. For Harry, it was devastation. He had believed he could build a future on the foundation of his mother's memory, but the scandal had proven otherwise. The foundation was too fragile, too burdened with grief and expectation, and it had crumbled beneath him. By the end of this chapter, one truth stood starkly clear: legacies are not unbreakable. They can be fractured, twisted, and tainted, not by the passage of time, but by the choices of those entrusted with them. Diana's legacy, once a beacon, now lay scattered in the wreckage of Harry and Meghan's story. And for Harry, staring at the remnants of that legacy in his Montecito vault, the question was no longer how to protect it, but whether it could ever be restored. Every story reaches a moment where the weight of all that has come before demands resolution, and for Harry, that reckoning arrived with the quiet force of inevitability. Months of turmoil had hollowed him out, leaving a man stripped of illusions, and now he faced the reality of his choices with clear, if painful, eyes. The betrayal over Diana's jewelry had not just cost him his marriage. It had altered the course of his life, reshaped his identity, and forced him to confront the deepest wounds of his past. The reckoning began with paperwork. Lawyers moved quietly in and out of Montecito, advisors whispered over secure phone lines, and decisions that had once seemed unthinkable were now being formalized. Divorce, custody, division of assets. Words Harry never thought would define his future now became the language of his days. The conversations were cold, clinical, a stark contrast to the fiery emotions that had fueled the scandal. For Harry, it was both relief and grief. Relief that the process would provide closure, grief that it was necessary at all. At the same time, Harry made a decision about Diana's jewelry that spoke volumes about his state of mind. No longer willing to keep the pieces vulnerable in Montecito, he arranged for them to be placed under the care of trustees connected to Diana's charitable legacy. Some items were moved to secure vaults in London, others entrusted to organizations that would preserve them for future generations. It was his way of reclaiming control, ensuring that his mother's memory would not again be tainted by personal betrayal. Yet, as he signed the documents and oversaw the transfers, the act felt less like triumph and more like surrender. He was letting go, not of her memory, but of his belief that he could carry it alone. The reckoning also forced him to face his family in London. Though communication with William remained strained, there was a moment, brief but real, when the brothers acknowledged the weight of what had happened. In a private meeting, away from cameras and courtiers, Harry reportedly told William, "I've lost too much already. I won't lose her memory again." William, still guarded, simply nodded. It was not reconciliation, but it was recognition, a shared understanding that whatever divided them, Diana's legacy was still the thread that bound them. Meghan, for her part, launched her own reckoning in the public sphere. She gave carefully crafted interviews, framing the scandal as a misunderstanding, painting herself as a woman mischaracterized by both the press and those closest to her. She insisted she had only ever acted in the best interest of her family, that her intentions had been twisted into something darker. But the reception was mixed. For every person who believed her, there were others who saw her words as further manipulation. The final reckoning for Meghan was not in the courts or contracts, but in reputation, a battle she would likely fight for the rest of her public life. Globally, the story reached its conclusion in a swirl of documentaries, exposés, and endless retrospectives. Networks aired specials recounting the scandal, complete with timelines, expert interviews, and dramatic reenactments. Each one sought to define the meaning of what had happened. Was it a love story gone wrong? A cautionary tale about ambition? A tragic echo of Diana's life and death? The interpretations varied, but the fascination was universal. The final reckoning was not just Harry's or Meghan's. It belonged to the world that had watched, judged, and absorbed every detail. For Harry, the deepest reckoning was internal. In the quiet of Montecito, after the lawyers and advisors had gone, after the headlines had moved on, he sat once more with his mother's jewelry, those that remained under his personal care. He held the aquamarine ring, tracing its edges with his thumb, and whispered words he had carried for decades. "I tried, Mom. I tried to keep you with me. But maybe the only way to honor you is to let go." The words were not defeat, they were acceptance. Acceptance that he could not rewrite history, that he could not protect everyone, that love, no matter how fierce, could be corrupted. The reckoning also extended to his children. Sitting with Archie and Lilibet, reading them stories, playing in the garden, Harry found a new purpose. If Diana's legacy had been shattered in the public eye, he could at least rebuild it privately, in the lessons he taught his children, in the love he gave them, in the honesty with which he would tell them about their grandmother one day. The world could debate endlessly, but in his home, he could ensure that Diana's memory was not betrayal but love. By the end of this chapter, the final reckoning had stripped away the noise, the speculation, the fury, leaving behind only the bare truths. Harry had chosen his mother's memory over his marriage. Meghan had chosen reinvention over reconciliation. The world had chosen judgment over nuance. And in that triad of choices lay the story of how a legacy, a marriage, and a family were undone. The reckoning did not bring joy, but it brought clarity. For Harry, clarity was enough. In the quiet of Montecito, with his children asleep and the California night pressing in, he understood at last that his life would always be divided into two parts: the years before betrayal and the years after. And though the cost was devastating, he also understood that survival itself was a kind of victory. Every story must come full circle, and for Harry, this one ended not with triumph, but with a painful clarity. What began as whispers of suspicion had escalated into confrontation, betrayal, expulsion, and global scandal. Along the way, the jewelry that once connected him to his mother became both the symbol of his deepest grief and the trigger for the collapse of his marriage. The conclusion of this saga was not simply about who was right or wrong, but about the profound human cost of love colliding with legacy. In the stillness of Montecito, Harry finally confronted what he had been avoiding for years: the truth that his life would always be lived under Diana's shadow. Her absence defined him, her memory guided him, and her legacy haunted him. Giving Meghan access to that legacy had been his ultimate act of trust, and watching her misuse it, whether through intention or desperation, had been the ultimate betrayal. Yet through the ashes of that betrayal, he discovered a truth he had long resisted: that no one else could carry his mother's memory for him. It was his burden, his responsibility, and his alone. The world, too, reached its own conclusions. To many, Meghan was forever tainted by the scandal, her name synonymous with betrayal. To others, she remained a woman misunderstood, a figure caught in the relentless machinery of monarchy and media. But whatever side people took, the conversation itself proved how enduring Diana's influence remained. Decades after her death, she could still command global attention, still spark debates about loyalty, power, and love. Her jewelry, glinting from velvet cases, had become more than heirlooms. They were battlegrounds for memory. For Harry's children, the story was only beginning. Archie and Lilibet would one day inherit not only pieces of jewelry, but the complex legacy of their grandmother. How they understood that legacy would depend on the stories Harry chose to tell, the values he chose to embody, and the strength he found in moving beyond betrayal. In his quiet moments, Harry resolved that their inheritance would not be scandal but love, not betrayal but resilience. It was the only way to reclaim what had been lost. The conclusion also lay in the silence between Harry and Meghan. Whatever love had once bound them was now fractured beyond repair. Their story, once celebrated as a fairy tale of modern love defying tradition, had ended as a cautionary tale about trust, ambition, and the dangers of building a life on fragile foundations. In the end, the man who had left his family to protect his wife found himself standing alone, guarding the memory of his mother with nothing left to lose. But perhaps the most haunting element of this conclusion was its reflection of Diana's own story. Just as she had been betrayed by those she trusted, just as she had been consumed by the machinery of power and image, so too had her son found himself ensnared. The cycle seemed inescapable, the tragedy inevitable. Yet within that tragedy was also a kind of redemption. By choosing to protect her jewelry, by reclaiming her memory from exploitation, Harry had honored her in the only way he knew how. The cost was his marriage, but the gain was a measure of peace with himself. The world will remember this story not just as a scandal, but as a parable about the fragility of love under the weight of legacy. It will be told as the tale of a prince who gave up everything for love, only to discover that love, when tested, could not bear the weight of grief. It will be remembered as the story of Meghan, who reached for reinvention but found herself undone by suspicion and ambition. And it will always, inevitably, circle back to Diana, whose presence loomed over every choice, every headline, every heartbreak. In the end, the conclusion is not neat. There is no clear victory, no tidy resolution. Harry is left alone in Montecito, raising his children, guarding his mother's memory, and trying to rebuild a life from the ruins of betrayal. Meghan moves forward in her own way, seeking to reclaim her image, perhaps never fully understanding the depth of what she had lost. The royal family, silent but watchful, continues its careful dance with history, relieved to see Meghan discredited but wary of Diana's ghost rising once more. And the rest of us, watching from afar, are left with questions that linger long after the story is told. What would we have done in Harry's place? How do we balance love with loyalty, memory with ambition? Can trust, once shattered, ever be restored? The answers may vary, but the power of the story lies in the fact that it makes us ask. As the California sun sets over Montecito, Harry closes the vault one final time, the jewels of Diana glinting in the darkness. They are safe, but safety comes at a cost. The house is quiet, the gates closed, the man within marked by loss but also by resilience. The conclusion of this saga is not about what was destroyed but about what endures. The unbreakable bond between a son and his mother, the determination to protect her memory, and the hope, faint but real, that love, even when broken, can still teach us what truly matters. The quiet streets of Montecito, California, had never seen anything like it. The sprawling estates, the manicured gardens, and the sense of calm that enveloped the wealthy enclave suddenly felt like the backdrop for a storm brewing just behind the walls of one of its most famous residences. Harry, the Duke of Sussex, once the boy who had stolen hearts worldwide alongside his mother, Princess Diana, now faced a crisis that threatened to shatter not just his private life, but the public image he had carefully constructed. It all began with a secret, a betrayal, and a jewel, one that carried the weight of legacy, love, and memory. For decades, Diana's jewelry had symbolized more than wealth or fashion. Each piece told a story, a memory preserved in gold and gemstones. The sapphire engagement ring, the diamond earrings, the intricate necklaces, these were not mere ornaments. They were fragments of a mother's love, of moments shared, of a life abruptly cut short. Harry inherited them not as trophies, but as relics, carrying the emotional burden of his mother's absence. Protecting them was his mission, a personal vow wrapped in grief and reverence. Then came Meghan. Meghan Markle, his wife, the woman who had captured his heart in a whirlwind of modern romance, had moved into Montecito with dreams of family, philanthropy, and perhaps her own imprint on history. At first, it seemed perfect. Their love was celebrated in headlines, in social media, in the eyes of those who longed for fairy tales in a world that so often felt cynical. But beneath the surface, tensions simmered. Differing views on privacy, legacy, and ambition created fractures that were invisible to outsiders but glaringly obvious within the walls of their home. The first hint of trouble appeared subtly. A few minor discrepancies, whispers of items being misplaced, and vague explanations from Meghan that left Harry unsettled. He dismissed them at first, chalking it up to stress, the strain of sudden fame, and the pressures of being under the constant gaze of the world. But intuition, that deep-seated instinct born from years of navigating loss and betrayal, nagged at him relentlessly. Something was off, and Harry was not a man who could ignore the feeling when the stakes were this high. Then the confirmation came. A single tip, almost casual in its delivery, but it carried the weight of truth. Diana's jewelry collection, the very items Harry had vowed to protect, had been spotted in a private sale arranged by Meghan. The implications were staggering. Selling these items was not just a breach of trust. It was a transgression against memory, against family, against the sanctity of what Diana had left behind. Harry felt the ground shift beneath him, a dizzying combination of shock, anger, and heartbreak. He confronted Meghan immediately, expecting denial, excuses, perhaps even an explanation that could salvage the situation. What he encountered instead was a mixture of defiance and rationalization, an attempt to frame the sale as strategic or harmless. Harry listened, each word a hammer striking the fragile walls of their marriage. He realized, in that moment, that this was not a minor lapse in judgment or a momentary lapse of integrity. This was a fundamental violation, one that could not be reconciled. The confrontation escalated quickly. Words were exchanged, voices rose, and the emotional tension that had been building over months erupted into a storm that threatened to consume them both. Harry's decision crystallized in that instant. Meghan could no longer remain in Montecito. The betrayal was too great, the stakes too high, the damage too irreversible. He had loved, trusted, and believed, but he would not allow the memory of his mother, nor the legacy she had entrusted to him, to be compromised under his roof. What followed was an expulsion that would reverberate beyond the walls of their estate. Meghan was asked to leave, not in subtle hints or quiet suggestions, but with the weight of irrevocable consequence. Montecito, once a sanctuary, had become a stage for public scrutiny, private heartbreak, and the unraveling of a relationship that had once seemed unassailable. News of the incident leaked, sparking a media frenzy that mirrored the intensity of the confrontation itself. Headlines questioned loyalty, morality, and the fragility of love under the pressures of legacy and fame. Yet, in the midst of public spectacle and private anguish, Harry was left with a complex mix of emotions. There was relief, undeniably, in reclaiming the sanctity of his home and protecting the jewelry that represented his mother. But there was also sorrow, an ache that no act of justice could soothe. He had been forced into a choice no one should face, balancing love against responsibility, desire against duty, emotion against principle. The story did not end with Meghan's departure. The ripple effects extended into social circles, family dynamics, and global discussions about the nature of trust, the sanctity of memory, and the weight of legacy. Experts in psychology and celebrity culture weighed in, dissecting the motives, the pressures, and the complex interplay of personality and circumstance. Legal analysts speculated about potential ramifications, though the sale itself remained private and obscured by layers of discretion and secrecy. Historians reflected on Diana's influence, noting how her life, and the life she left behind in objects and memories, continued to shape the choices of those who followed her. And through it all, the jewels remained. Sapphire rings, diamond necklaces, and heirloom earrings glimmered under protective glass, symbols of love, loss, and the intricate connections between family and memory. They were reminders of what had been sacrificed, of what had been nearly lost, and of the resilience required to protect the bonds that truly matter. Each piece carried its own story, its own weight of emotion, and each became a silent witness to the drama that had unfolded within the walls of Montecito. In this introduction, the stage is set. The stakes are high, the emotions raw, and the narrative threads poised for unraveling. Harry's love for his mother, his commitment to integrity, and his desire for personal peace collide with the actions of the woman he trusted most. The consequences of those collisions will shape the coming chapters, revealing the depth of betrayal, the intensity of confrontation, and the enduring impact of legacy on the human heart. The viewer is invited to follow each step, to witness each revelation, and to grapple with the complex interplay of emotion, morality, and familial duty. This is more than a story of scandal. It is a story of love tested, of trust broken, and of the courage required to stand by one's principles when the world watches. The narrative promises tension, heartbreak, reflection, and insight, a dramatic journey through a moment in time that is as poignant as it is sensational. The morning sunlight in Montecito had a serene, almost deceptive quality that day. Birds chirped softly, a gentle breeze stirred the towering palm trees, and the scent of the ocean lingered faintly in the air. To the casual observer, everything seemed perfect, untouched, and calm. But inside the walls of Harry and Meghan's estate, the tension was palpable, thick enough to choke the space. Harry had woken with a gnawing sense of unease, a feeling that had been growing over weeks but intensified overnight. Something was amiss. It started with small inconsistencies. Jewelry that had been carefully cataloged, photographed, and stored seemed to have been moved. A pair of earrings misplaced on the dressing table, a bracelet left out of its usual protective casing. At first, Harry brushed it off, attributing it to human error, the rush of their hectic schedules, or simple forgetfulness. But deep down, he knew the truth. Something didn't add up. His instincts, honed through years of loss and navigating the treacherous waters of public scrutiny, whispered warnings he could not ignore. Harry's first step was methodical. He began reviewing security footage from the previous nights, checking the movements within the estate, every camera angle, every shadow. His brow furrowed as he paused and rewound footage multiple times, trying to make sense of what he saw. And then, there it was, a brief, almost imperceptible moment that spoke volumes. Meghan, alone, in the private study where Diana's jewelry was kept. She handled the pieces with care, her hands moving over them with a familiarity that suggested intent beyond admiration. The footage was clear enough to reveal her organizing, selecting, and even making notations in a small notebook. Harry's heart sank. The weight of realization pressed down on him like a physical force. This was not a casual oversight, a forgetfulness, or a harmless misstep. This was planning. The implications were staggering, far-reaching, and deeply personal. Diana's jewelry had never been mere accessories. They were symbols of history, of love, of a life violently cut short. Each piece carried emotional weight, a silent narrative of the woman Harry had lost. And now, it appeared, that sacred trust was being violated under his own roof. Unable to sit idle, Harry decided to investigate further. He discreetly contacted a trusted friend within the world of high-end jewelry, someone who could provide insight without drawing public attention. When he described the situation, the expert's response was immediate and grave. Selling or attempting to sell such high-profile pieces would attract significant attention. The market for Diana's jewelry was not just niche, it was intensely scrutinized. Anyone attempting to move them would be taking enormous risks, legally, socially, and morally. The stakes were staggering. Armed with this confirmation, Harry confronted Meghan. The encounter was tense, electric, and emotionally charged. He approached her in the study where the jewelry had been moved, his expression a mix of disbelief, hurt, and anger. Meghan, sensing the confrontation, quickly composed herself. But composure could not mask the tension in her eyes, the subtle defensiveness in her posture. "Harry, I can explain," she began, her voice measured but carrying an edge of urgency. "This isn't what it looks like." Harry's gaze hardened. "Meghan, don't try to tell me this isn't serious. I've seen the footage. I know what you've been doing." For a moment, silence hung between them, thick and suffocating. The weight of decades of family history, public scrutiny, and personal trust pressed down on the room. Harry's mind raced, analyzing every angle, every possible explanation, but none could reconcile the reality he was witnessing. Meghan attempted to justify her actions, claiming strategic necessity, asserting that she had plans for the jewelry that could benefit their family financially or socially. But to Harry, the words were hollow. It was not just the act itself, but the betrayal, the fact that it had been done without his knowledge or consent. The violation of trust cut deeper than any financial implication could. He felt as though a part of his mother's memory, something sacred and untouchable, had been desecrated. The confrontation escalated. Voices rose, emotions flared, and the private sanctuary of their home became a battleground. Harry, usually measured and composed, allowed his shock and anger to surface fully. Meghan, equally determined, defended her choices with fervor. The argument was not just about jewelry. It was about integrity, legacy, and the invisible lines that separate love from manipulation. As the argument reached its peak, Harry made a decision that would forever alter the trajectory of their relationship. He realized that the breach of trust was irreparable. The safety of Diana's legacy, the sanctity of their home, and his own principles demanded decisive action. There was no room for hesitation or compromise. Meghan would have to leave. That decision was not made lightly. Harry's heart ached with the realization that love alone could not rectify a betrayal of this magnitude. Yet, his resolve was unwavering. Protecting what was sacred, both the jewelry and the principles it represented, was paramount. He would act, even if it meant heartbreak, even if it meant public scrutiny, even if it meant redefining his life without the woman he had once loved. Outside, Montecito remained serene, oblivious to the drama unfolding within its walls. But inside, history was being written, not in ink, but in choices, actions, and the irrevocable consequences of trust broken. Harry's world had shifted in an instant, propelled by revelation, betrayal, and the fierce determination to honor his mother's memory. The discovery was just the beginning. The chapters that followed would expose deeper layers of manipulation, reveal the complexity of Meghan's motives, and explore the profound emotional fallout of a private life thrown into chaos. For Harry, every decision moving forward would be informed by that moment of clarity, the moment he realized that protecting his mother's legacy was non-negotiable, and that the woman he loved had crossed a line from which there could be no return.